Chapter 3, Legal Issues, Part 9. Okay, are you tired of criminal procedure? Probably. There is a ton more to be said about criminal procedure. If you go to law school, you're going to have at least 2 semesters of criminal procedure. And I'm giving you about, an hour and a half of criminal procedure in these PowerPoints. So we are only scratching the surface. If you go on to become a police officer, you are going to be dealing with a lot of criminal procedure when you go through the academy. So I just kind of wanted to introduce you to the basic foundations, talking about incorporation, and some of the key points, just really scratching the surface only of the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, and even less about the Sixth Amendment right to attorney. But I hope you have at least a little better understanding of some of the famous cases and how the Supreme Court interprets some of these constitutional protections. Well, let's move on to other ways that police are controlled. So we're really done with criminal procedure. That was one way that we control police action, but we also have other ways that we can control police action through legal procedures. And one way is through lawsuits. And so police can be sued. Sometimes there's immunity that protects individual police officers against lawsuits in certain situations. So you can only maybe sue the municipality, you can't sue the individual officer. But even there is sometimes immunity for police departments. We're not going to get into all those issues. That would take us far too long. We're just going to talk about some of the ways that people can sue and look at just a couple of the laws that can be used. Police can be responsible for torts. A tort, as you see here, is a civil wrong. There are a couple different ways that you can cause a tort, and what I mean by civil wrong, if you think of just what you might have seen on TV in shows like Judge Judy or The People's Court or something like that, or maybe you've been involved in suing for injuries that you sustained because of a car accident, or you tripped and fell in some store and you want to sue the store because it was their negligence that caused it. Well, a tort is just that. It's a civil wrong. It could also be a criminal wrong as well, but it's some kind of injury that's caused to another person, either intentionally or by negligence. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but certainly police can be responsible for this. A police officer could do something that was tortious, that was possibly a criminal wrong, but also a civil wrong, and you could sue them for the damages that they caused you. So one kind of tort would be an intentional tort. Now this is one where the police are not acting with negligence, but they are intending to do harm. So maybe it's, here the example I have would be something like excessive use of force. They beat you. And it's not a lawful beating. You weren't resisting arrest to the point where they should have beaten you to that degree, and they caused you serious injuries. Well, that's an intentional tort. That wasn't through their negligence that they injured you, but they intentionally injured you. Or maybe, as you see here also, they falsely arrested you. And so there's a lot of protection for the police in these matters, but still they can go too far. And you can show that it was an intentional tort, therefore they should be liable. Maybe there was a wrongful death. They used lethal force when they shouldn't have used it. And so you're able to show that it was an intentional tort, or maybe we'll see here in a second it was negligence, and you can sue them. Obviously you can if you're dead, but your survivors can sue on your behalf for wrongful death. So again, it could be injuries, it could be the false arrest that infringed on your liberties, it could be other kinds, all the way up to even death, other kinds of injuries. Another kind of tort would be a negligent tort. This is when police are not purposely trying to hurt you like in an intentional tort, but this is where they failed to exercise the proper standard of care. So maybe they were, chasing a suspect and they wrecked into your car. You were completely innocent, but that police officer was way out of control, should have never given chase to the suspect. This was a busy city street. Departmental policies were against it, all these kinds of things. But the officer still did it and wrecked into your car and caused injuries to your car, or I should say damages to your car, or injuries to you. And you can sue the police department if we show that the officer was negligent. Now, if the officer wasn't negligent, if the officer had just cause for chasing that other person and was acting according to all of their training, then you may not be able to get any money back, even if they do wreck into you. But if we can show that they were negligent, they did not exercise the standard of care, they might be responsible. There are some federal laws that allow for lawsuits by private individuals for violations of their constitutional and federally protected rights. And so 42 U.S.C. 1983, that's a citation that tells you where to find it in federal law, but you also often just see this particular law referred to as Section 1983. So that's not saying the year, because this particular law actually dates back to right after the end of the Civil War. The federal government was concerned that the states would try to deprive the newly freed slaves of their rights. And so the particular law was written to try to deal with that situation. So it allows citizens, private citizens, to bring lawsuits in federal courts for violations of their rights. What does it require? And it's still with us today. It's one of the most common laws in which private individuals sue the government, not just the police, but maybe other branches of the government. What does it require? It requires that the person must act under color of law. And what that means is, when we say color of law, is they must be acting in their official capacity. Now, there was a time that this was used to prevent people from suing. The courts gave it a really strange meaning. What the court said was, well, if a police officer beats a confession out of you, that certainly wasn't authorized by law for them to do that, so therefore they weren't acting under color of state law. So even though you were beaten by the police and deprived of certain key rights, like due process and Fifth Amendment, we're not going to allow you to sue them because that officer was acting outside of the law. Well, this was crazy because this prevented really any kind of lawsuit against the police. Well, eventually the courts changed the way they interpreted this particular law. And what they said was the meaning of under the color of law is, this is, if we're talking about police, this is a police officer acting as a police officer. So it's not a police officer who is act on their own time off duty and they do something to you, or it's not a police officer who is shaking you down for an illegal drug payment, but this is an officer who's carrying out his or her responsibilities. So when we mean that they're acting under the color of state law, they're not acting in the interest of their own personal gain, their own personal corruption, but they're acting to get a conviction. They're acting to subdue a suspect. They're acting to do things that are reasonably a part of their legitimate job. And so, but they're doing it badly. So, they're beating a suspect. They're applying a chokehold when they shouldn't, and the person dies, or whatever it might be. So this is what we now mean by under color of state law. They're doing it, in essence, to further their duties as police, to catch criminals, to enforce the law, those kinds of things. So it could include, again, use of force against people. It could include things like racial profiling. It could include a bunch of things. But it's not for their own personal benefit and gain. They see it as part of their job. Secondly, their actions have to deprive a person of a federal right or some other protection guaranteed under federal law. I should say, before I go on to this next slide, that under Section 1983, class actions can be brought. So that means either one single individual can bring a 1983 lawsuit, or a whole group. Maybe when they're alleging racial profiling, they can bring this kind of lawsuit against the police or against a police department, municipality. There are other state and federal laws that provide for civil lawsuits. We're not going to go into all the particular individual ones, but there are others that provide lawsuits against the police department. We are going to talk about one a little bit later that allows the U.S. Attorney General to bring a civil lawsuit against a police department to try to force it to change. But we'll get to that later in the course when we talk about change and the police. It should also be noted that police officers can be prosecuted for crimes. There are several federal laws that make it a crime not only a civil wrong to violate a person's rights, but also a criminal wrong, a crime to violate a person's federally protected rights. And there are also state laws that provide for crimes. Plus, police officers can be charged with any other crime. If a police officer murders someone, a police officer can be charged with murder. But again, there are specific criminal laws that pertain to law enforcement officers depriving people of their federally protected rights, or if we're talking about state law, their state protected rights. So if you are any bit familiar with the Rodney King incident in LA, the Los Angeles police officers were found not guilty under state law, but they were found guilty for violating Rodney King's federally protected rights under federal law and in a federal court. So there are possibilities for criminal penalties for officers who violate people's rights. Finally, your book mentions a concern about depolicing, because there's this concern that lawsuits are just rampant. Every time the police look the wrong way at a person, they're going to be sued in court, and that's not really happening. I mean, there are lots of lawsuits from time to, and many get settled, even when the police officers think that they shouldn't. But it's not as if every police officer is going to be sued in their lifetime. There's still successful lawsuits against the police are still relatively rare. We hear about them, but they're still relatively rare. But nonetheless, the police are concerned about criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits against them, and this may lead to what your book calls depolicing. And so this happens when police officers say, "Hey, I'm not going to be aggressive. I'm not going to be really gung ho in my job, because I'm going to get sued, or maybe I'll even get arrested. And so I'm going to depolice. I'm going to police the streets less. I'm going to interact less with the people on the street, because I'm afraid of lawsuits. I'm afraid of criminal prosecutions." How much is this actually happening in policing? We don't have a clear sense of it, but could it be happening? Certainly. Just like in any other profession that's worried about lawsuits. That may discourage people in those professions from taking chances. But that may not be an altogether bad thing, because if it's causing them to kind of restrain themselves, that probably means they're restraining themselves from doing the more unlawful things, the things that the lawsuits were meant to respond to. And so, what is the balance? If we look at it over the long term, are we actually gaining better policing than actually losing it?